Okay, so I'm wearing a bunch of hats today. So if you have your notebooks, if you flip over to like page 2 real quick, you kind of see our schedule for what we're going to do. This is church history from Christ to Schism, and if you don't know what that means, then, we'll talk about it as we go. And so you look at the topics, and these are tentative. They're pretty firm, but they're not totally firm. So we may move it around a little bit. And if you want to kind of follow along, a lot of what we're doing in this class is just basically going through this book by Everett Ferguson. This is, if you don't know who Everett Ferguson is, he is the leading scholar in the first century world, first century Christianity, and a very, very well-known, respected church historian. He's a professor down at Abilene. He's a member of the church, and he's in his upper 90s, I think, maybe a little bit younger than that. But he's all but retired now, but he is the source to go to. And so you want to know some stuff, read some Everett Ferguson. If you want to kind of follow along and read ahead, this is the book I'm getting a lot of this from. And so that'll be good. So you can see the topics. Some of those words you may not know, so that's okay. Some of them are names. The Augustinian and Pelagian controversy, those are names of people that we're going to talk about. But that's okay. We'll get through this as we go. Look at the very back page now that I gave you, and you'll see some terms and vocab. We'll be going through this, I think, probably about every session, because odds are there's some words that we're going to be using that you may not be familiar with. And so to talk about things, you have to use the terms that mean the things. And so I know it might be a little bit confusing at first, but I won't give you a deep run through these each time, but just to kind of talk about some of these terms that we're going to use. Today we're talking about the Apostolic age, and as you might see in that word apostolic is the word apostle, and so this is the age of the apostles, the age immediately following after Jesus, and so the birth of Christianity on up until about the year 100, give or take some, exact dates can wiggle a little bit, when the Apostle John, who's the last apostle, dies. And so that's kind of the period we're going to talk about today. Begins at Pentecost with the beginning of the church, ends with the ends of the apostles. The second term that we're going to talk a lot about just throughout this whole class is just the term theology. You may know that term, but theology is just the study of God. When you talk about theology, you talk about the nature of God. What is God like? What are the things He does? What are the things He doesn't do? All of that falls into it. And from a knowledge of who God is, you can pull different doctrines, different teachings. And so theology is really important, and especially as we get into what we're going to talk about in some subsequent weeks, we're going to talk a lot about theology and those sorts of things, because that's really at the heart of a lot of the issues that are happening in the church after the first century. The term Christian, I think all of you have probably heard that word before. It's Christian, if you want to say it with, but a Christian is just simply a follower of Christ. And in this class, we're going to use that term kind of fast and loose. I think when a lot of us use that term, we have something very specific in mind. We're going to use that term a little bit more broadly than you typically would, just for the sake of this class. And so I don't want to, every single time you talk about somebody who holds some views that we would be very much in disagreement with, I don't want to have to every single time say, qualify my use of the word Christian. So just keep that in mind. And the same thing for church. along the same lines. Just a group of Christians, and there's definitely going to be some things that we're going to disagree with a lot of churches in this time period, but we're going to use that term kind of fast and loose. The term orthodox, that's probably a word you've heard, but may not be able just to define. The word orthodox just means right teaching. Orth is kind of the word right in Greek, and dox is the word teaching. And so when we talk about things that are orthodox, we're talking about things that are correct. And so if you were to talk about the nature of God, you can say, God is triune, he's 3 in 1. That's the orthodox teaching. There might be some groups, and we're going to talk about some groups later, that teach that God is not 3 in 1, that Jesus is something different than God the Father. And so that's going to be a heretical view. Orthodox and heresy are opposites of each other. And so the word heresy just means a sect or a divide. And it's actually used a couple times in the Bible. It's used in Acts 24. But it's something that is deviant from what is right teaching. And so we're going to use those terms a lot, maybe a little bit today, probably not a ton today, but we're going to use those terms a lot throughout the course of this class. So if you ever hear it and you forget, just flip back and you can see. Let's see. Let me get over here now. So today we're talking about the beginnings of the church, and I think this is a really important topic, and it's a topic that you may or may not have studied all that. You've probably talked about the things we're going to talk about today more than the things we're going to talk about in the next couple weeks. But I think church history is a really good thing to talk about. Have any of you had a class on church history, or have studied this by yourself, or read books or anything like that? A little bit. Yeah, long time ago, a little bit. I think that's the camp most people are in. You may have, at some point in time, studied or read a book or had a class or something, and so maybe as we go through, you'll have some awakening moments where you remember a name back from 30 years ago, and you have an aha. So why do we even bother studying church history to begin with? I think that's a good question. And I think a lot of people would say, well, who cares about a bunch of dead people who lived a bunch of hundreds, thousands of years ago? What's the point? Who cares? What would you say to that kind of thought? Yeah. So on a certain level, history in of itself is very helpful because it teaches us you can learn the mistakes of the past, right? And you can hopefully avoid repeating them. So there's a value in history, just generally speaking. I think church history, though, is often somewhat neglected. I think we spend a lot of time in, political history, in that kind of sort of thing, but we don't spend a lot of time talking about church history as much, and I think that's probably to our detriment in a lot of ways. And so I have a couple reasons why I think we should be studying some church history. I think a good reason, just to begin with, is theological understanding. There are a lot of things that are going to happen in this time period that are going to help us understand the religious world we live in today. And there's doctrines that people teach today that are heretical, that are very false and wrong doctrines. And you see that today and you say, well, how could anybody ever believe that? And how do I even address that kind of argument? But you go back and lo and behold, they're having the exact same conversation 1,500 years ago. And there's a lot of good, these things come up and they come up and they come up. And there's a lot of good argumentation. there's religious groups today that deny the deity of Christ. And so there's a lot that's going to be said in the coming weeks about the deity of Christ. And so a lot of the same arguments that are made today are the same arguments that are made way back when. And so there's a good value there. You see how they addressed those challenges that are still present. And I think religious heritage. We often talk about restorationism, and I think that's good. I definitely say I'm a restorationist. I want to restore the church that Christ intended, right? I want to do the things the Bible teaches, and I want to do them in the way that the Bible teaches them to be done. But it would be somewhat naive to say that we are totally unaffected by the 2,000 years between Jesus and us today. It would be naive. And so there are some developments that have happened that still impact us. And I'm not saying that that restorationism is an impossible thing. That's not what I'm saying. But I think having this study is really important so that we sometimes don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And I think that sometimes you can get to that point where you say, well, all of these people have, all these views that are sometimes wrong, and so let's just disregard everything they have to say because it's not helpful to me. I think that might be too strong of a view. So any thoughts about that before we get going? All right. So a couple disclaimers before, as we get started. Hold on. Sorry. My program's messing up. There. So a couple thoughts as we get started. I am not an expert, so I just want to make that abundantly clear. I've had a couple classes in this at Freed, and I've read a couple books here and there, but I am in no way an expert in this area. And so you may ask some questions, and I am totally okay with saying, I don't know. And so feel free to ask questions. That's fine. But, don't expect everything that I say to be, hard and fast. This is the, I'm going to try my best to give you correct and accurate information. I think I'll do that. But just realize that I'm not somebody who's spent my entire life doing this. And there are people who've done that. Everett Ferguson is one of those people who has done that. And so a big reason for why I'm doing this class in general is, one, I think it's kind of fun. But two, this is stuff that I'm really interested in, but have kind of let go to the back of my brain at some point. And the best way to learn something is to teach it. And so this class is 90% for me, about 10% for you. And that's why you're sitting in those uncomfortable chairs, because I like to see you suffer. But this class is mostly for me. I'm just going to be honest. I hope you all get some stuff out of it. But this is just a little fun project for me to kind of refresh and solidify some of these things that I've studied several years ago and have some notes for myself in the future. Another disclaimer, I guess, is there's many ways to interpret historical events. You can state facts, but every fact is going to be interpreted through some lens. And so if you read a Catholic church historian, you're going to get a church history that looks different than Everett Ferguson's church history, just on the basic assumptions that they bring to the table in certain areas. And so when you do that, I think it's important to realize that you can have multiple interpretations that are not all totally wrong. And so, and certain interpretations that are not all totally right. And so there's some nuance that goes into all of this. And the things we're going to talk about, we are not going to be able to cover nearly in the totality of the depth of knowledge that there is about these things. It's just not going to happen. We'd be here until, Christ comes back. But we're we're going to give you just kind of a general overview of some of these things. And so a lot of the things that we're going to talk about in this class may strike you as theologically incorrect. And a lot of things we're going to talk about are theologically incorrect. And even some things that scholars may classify as orthodox may strike you as theologically incorrect. And I'd argue it's because it is theologically incorrect. And so the terms orthodox and heresy are helpful, but they're not set in stone. Our standard is not what Ferguson thinks. Our standard is not what somebody else thinks. Our standard is the Bible, of course. And so just keep that in mind as we get going. All right. I think that's my spiel before we really get into stuff. Any thoughts or questions about any of that? Are you sufficiently bored? Okay. Yeah, not yet. Well, it's coming. It's not like last year where we had long lists of who killed who. Well, it might get that way a little bit. But let's talk about some major influences on the early church. When you talk about the environment that the church is in the first century, there's three big cultures that have really helped shape that. And the first, I think, is the Greek. So when you think about the Greeks, we talked about this a whole lot last year when we talked about the intertestamental period, right? The period between the Old Testament and New Testament. The world changed a lot in that time period. And some of you may remember some of the things that we talked about. You go from an independent Israel, independent Judah, and then you have the Babylonians and the Persians and the Greeks and all that, and then eventually the Romans. The world's changed a lot since the Old Testament. And so the New Testament world is heavily influenced by the Greeks. Alexander the Great comes in and he conquers, and then Alexander dies and his generals take over, and you have wars and all sorts of things. And so what Alexander did is he conquered the world, and obviously not the entire world, but he conquered the whole known world at the time, just about. It's said that he wept because he had run out of lands to conquer. And that kind of influence is drastic because you have from Europe to Africa, Asia, you have a common culture that has infiltrated and dominated all the other cultures. And so what you have with Alexander the Great is a great deal of spread of Greek ideas and thoughts. You have Greek religion that spreads throughout the world. And the Romans are, for example, are big adopters of the Greek religion, right? Zeus gets kind of incorporated into Rome's idea of Jupiter and all that kind of thing. So Greek religion is a really big influence. And in the Bible lands, in Israel area, you have things like statues being erected to Zeus in Jerusalem and things like that are big issues. You eventually get a sect of Jews that are called Hellenists. The word Hellenist means Greekified, and so there's a big Hellenist contention of early Christians, right? Jews that were very Greek in their culture that are now Christians. And so you can imagine that's going to have some big ramifications in their relationships with, very Jewish Jews and, even the Greeks or non-Jews, Gentiles. And so that's going to be a big factor is religion. Philosophy is going to be very big. Philosophy is one of those things that is hard to talk about sometimes. But think of some of the big name people like Plato and Aristotle, and you may not even know what they taught or any of that kind of thing, but their thoughts have had an enormous impact on the world you live in. Claire is, I remember she took a botany class in college, and part of her botany class was she had to identify a bunch of plants around Henderson and all that. Aristotle is the one whose famous for his taxonomy. He comes up with classifications of things, and he puts things in boxes. And so, even today, thousands of years later, we're using the thoughts of Aristotle in everyday life. And so the Greek philosophy is really important, and it infiltrates Judaism. There's a Jewish writer named Philo of Alexandria. He's down in Alexandria, Egypt. He's very famous because he writes all sorts of commentaries on the Old Testament, and he is incredibly Platonic in his writings. He borrows very, very heavily from the writings of Plato and the philosophy of Plato. And so Greek philosophy very much infiltrates its way into Jewish culture and Christian culture. Paul talks a lot in philosophy terms, especially when Paul goes to the Areopagus, to Mars Hill, and he's speaking with a bunch of philosophers. He uses philosophy terms. He says, you guys are I perceive you're very what? Religious. The word he uses there is a Greek word, desidaimonia. It's the word superstitious. You guys are, he says, it's not a compliment. He says, you guys are gullible. You would believe in anything. And in Greek thought, there was a scale. You don't want to be desidaimonia. You don't want to be so religious that you're superstitious and you'll fall for anything. On the other side, you don't want to be atheist. You don't want to have not enough religion. You want to be somewhere in the middle. You want to be Eusebius, pious. And so Paul is kind of throwing them under the bus. He's saying, you guys are a bunch of superstitious. Anyway, and so Paul will very frequently use philosophy in his arguments and his conversation and in his evangelism to Greek-speaking people. Corinth is a major center of Greek philosophy. And when he goes to Corinth, he speaks in a lot of philosophical terms and writes with a lot of philosophical terms. And so philosophy is really important. Language, obviously. Greek is the language of the world. Everywhere Alexander conquers, people are now speaking Greek. And so it's not a surprise then that the New Testament's written in Greek. Because everyone speaks it. And so Galatians talks about in the fullness of time, God sent his son. I think a big part of that is this universal language that is now spread throughout the world. It's easy to write a document in Judea or some other Roman province or wherever, and somebody on the other side of the world can read it. You have Romans in Rome, that's far to the east, west. I'm terrible at directions. Far to the west, and you have Christians in Ephesus in the east, and you got Christians in Alexandria in the south, and all of them are speaking Greek, and so they can all read the same scriptures. And so that's going to be a really big influence. You have Roman influence, and so imperial Rome is everywhere in the New Testament, right? It's the Romans that are governing when Jesus is alive. And you can see throughout the Bible, we won't look at all these verses, but in Luke 3, it talks about the ministry beginning in the year of Tiberius and such and such. It's how they're marking when all this is happening. In John 19, when Jesus is being crucified, they nail the board above his head that says, "Here's the King of the Jews." What languages do they put it in? They put it in Hebrew or Aramaic, because that's the language of the people, Greek, because that's the language everybody speaks, and Latin, because that's the new upstart language that everybody's going to be speaking in the Roman Empire. It's not the common language necessarily, but it's the official government language. And so Latin's going to be a very, very important language. Acts 13, Acts 25, in Acts 25, you have Paul appeals to Caesar. All of these are very important Roman presences in the Bible. And so imperial Rome is just everywhere. And so Rome as much as we think of it being a terrible thing, it does a lot of good throughout the world, and I think plays a big part in that fullness of time that Paul talks about in Galatians. You think just about roads and infrastructure. That sounds really boring, but it is mind-boggling the things that the Romans could accomplish. It is absolutely insane that a lot of the roads that they made thousands of years ago are still being used today and are still functional. And Roman roads connect the world. Imagine, I frequently will think about Lewis and Clark, just about how incredibly difficult it is to traverse through wilderness. It's incredible what they did. And while you may not have quite as wilderness in this area because it's a lot more settled and that sort of thing, just imagine traveling 300 miles by foot through a place where there's no good roads. That's impossible. That's incredibly difficult. And so the roads of Rome, I think, play an important part in the spreading of the gospel and the early church. You have Latin, we talked about that. And then you have what's called the Pax Romana. And we talked about this a little bit last summer when we talked about the intertestamental period. What that means is Roman peace. And certainly Rome brought a great deal of stability to the world. Just about wherever you went, you knew who was in charge. And if there's one thing the Romans are really good at, it's having order. And the one thing the Romans are very against is disorder, right? And so Rome is going to be incredibly peaceful, especially relative to the world. Maybe not peaceful by some today's standards, but it's going to be a peaceful time. A good example of this is, piracy. And you think about the Mediterranean Sea and traveling by ship, and Paul takes a lot of big ship rides, right? A big motivating, or a big, what's the word I'm looking for? A big objective of the Roman Empire was to cut down on piracy. And they do that, and they're very effective at that. And so, that kind of thing is really important and allows for Paul to do what Paul did, go travel place to place. And as a Roman citizen, Paul had a lot of protections as he did that. And so Rome's going to be an important influence. And then probably the most important is the Jewish influence. Judaism is the context for Christianity. You can't separate them. You can't say, Christianity did not come in a vacuum. Jesus himself was a Jew. He grew up under the law and kept the law. And so when you think about what Jesus did, you think about his messianic claims and his messianic status, you have to look at Judaism. You can't understand it any way else. There's no concept of what a Messiah would be unless you read the Old Testament scriptures. And the New Testament church very highly valued the Old Testament. It was authoritative. It was from God. And so wherever the New Testament church is, there's Old Testament scriptures there because they value them and they're inspired from God. And so Judaism is going to be a major influence. And it's going to cause some issues too. We will think about the circumcision controversies that you have. That's going to be a big hiccup for a lot of Christians. You have a whole debate about, do we have to keep the law? How much of the law do we have to keep? What about these Gentiles? Do they have to keep the law? All of that's going to be a big issue. As Judaism is dispersed through the world, which it is, you remember we talk about in our intertestamental period class the diaspora, which means the spreading. What you have is pockets of Judaism that are now all throughout the world and not just located in Israel. There's a large Jewish population in Rome, for example. And so what you're going to have then is people that are very familiar with the Old Testament And the prophecies and the Messiah of the Old Testament, when they realize about Jesus, they're quick to respond. And so when Paul goes about his missionary journeys, where does he go? He goes to the synagogues first, and he talks with the Jews. And then they're the people that are, Gentile God-fearers. And then he goes to the Gentile population. And so having pockets of Judaism spread throughout the world is going to be a very big factor in the early church. Okay, any thoughts about that? Because that's a lot. We covered a lot so far. All righty then. So let's talk about some major centers of Christianity. And the first one is obviously the church in Jerusalem. When the church begins, it begins in Jerusalem. You go all the way back to Acts chapter 2. It's in Jerusalem that Jesus is crucified. It's in Jerusalem where Jesus is Jesus is raised from the dead. It's in Jerusalem that the apostles are gathered together, and Peter preaches on Pentecost. And so Jerusalem is very obviously a major, major center for Christianity. In the early days of Christianity, you have a lot of persecution that's happening locally in Jerusalem. Think about it is not very long between when Paul or Saul is persecuting the Christians, the stoning of Stephen. These are very big events. You have the execution of James, the brother of John. You have the arrest of Peter. You had the arrest of Peter and John back in, but they get out, and so there's going to be some persecution that happens, and that persecution is going to be a big push for the church there in Jerusalem. And a big factor of that, or a big result from that persecution, is going to be the rise in prominence of James, the brother of Jesus, who's sometimes called James the Just. And he's going to be very important. There's a Eusebius. We should have talked about him a little bit earlier. Eusebius is the church historian who's writing several hundred years after Jesus. He's very, very important because he records all sorts of things. You have to take a lot of what he says, though, with a grain of salt because he likes to embellish. But Eusebius has he's valuable also because he records a lot of other people's writings that we don't have anymore, quotes them, which is valuable. One of these quotes is from a guy by the name of Hegesippus, or I'm not sure exactly how you say it, but he records some stuff about the death of James. Now, I think it's interesting. He calls James, his nickname was apparently Camel Knees, because he spent so much time in the temple praying that his knees became calloused like a camel's knees. And I think that speaks to some degree about the integration of Judaism and Christianity. When James is killed, which Hegesippus is going to talk about, James is brought to the top of the temple, and the Pharisees ask him to denounce his faith, and he doesn't. And so they push him off the cliff, and he falls, and he's not dead when he falls, but he's all mangled and broken. And so they start stoning him to finish the job. And as they're stoning him, he's praying for the people that are stoning him, saying that they don't know what they're doing, and he's ultimately killed. Perhaps that's embellished a little bit. He probably was killed in that way. But there's a very close relationship between the Jews and the Christians at this point. The Christians gather in synagogues to worship very, very frequently in the first century. And James prays in the temple. very often in the first century. And so there's a closeness that's going to become more and more distinct. And people who are outside of Judaism, the Romans, for example, when they see Christians, they don't understand that Christians are not Jews. Because Christians do a lot of the things that Jews do, right? They teach a lot of the things that the Jews teach. The Jews are very famous because they worship one God, right? And the Christians worship one God. So, what are these Christians? They must just be a sect of Judaism. And so, and it doesn't necessarily help that the Christians are worshiping in synagogues, and the Christians are still going to the temple and praying in the temple and that sort of thing. So there's a very closeness, but it's going to become increasingly distant as time goes by. And I think a good example of this is the Jerusalem Council. We see this a lot maybe subtly in the writings of the epistles, because there's a lot of Christians that are really steadfast and staunch about keeping the things of the law. They're very, very much pushing the fact that Gentiles, you need to keep the law. And so what you have in the Jerusalem Council in Acts chapter 15 is a meeting of the minds. And so this is boiling over. It's coming to a head. We got to figure out what is the deal with the law and Gentiles? What's the relationship here? And so you have the apostles, the elders at Jerusalem, among whom James is probably one of them at this point. And they settled this matter once and for all, with the authority of the Holy Spirit, obviously. And they say the Gentiles, they don't have to be circumcised. We're not under the law. And so, all of this to say that there's some tension between what are Christians. Are they Jews? Are they not Jews? And there's some confusion even among certain Christians about what they are at this point. And I think to a certain degree, I think you have to make somewhat of a distinction between the church that the Bible is teaching about and the people that are existing. When we read the Bible, we are reading inspired authors who are giving instructions, right, about the way things should be. But you have Joe in Ephesus who's not necessarily inspired the way that Paul is inspired. And so Paul is teaching what true Christianity should be, but Joe is practicing it imperfectly. And I think that's the distinction that needs to be made when we talk about first century Christianity, is that Joe may be receiving the instruction from Paul and trying to put that in practice. Think about Corinth. They've got all kinds of issues, and they've had 2 letters, probably 4 letters, and they're still struggling at the end of the first century. And so I think that's an important thing to talk about a little bit. But there's some confusion about what are Christians. Are they Jews? Are they not Jews? And even some Christians have some questions about, are we Jews or are we not Jews? Any thoughts about that? Okay. So James is eventually martyred in Jerusalem. We talked about that. James is very, very important figure in early Jerusalem. You have the church at Antioch. And Antioch is famous, obviously, because it's where the people are first called Christians. And so the church begins in Antioch in the aftermath of the Christian diaspora, the Christian spreading from the persecution in Jerusalem. So when Saul begins his persecution, you had the stoning of Stephen. Acts chapter 11 talks about the Christians flee, and a lot of them flee to Antioch. And so a church comes up in Antioch. And it's a church that Paul will frequent as he goes about his missionary journeys. And as Paul goes throughout the world, Antioch becomes a very big supporter of him and very important in helping to facilitate the missionary journeys that he's going to go on. But when you think about Antioch, there's 2 main important people that are associated with it in the Bible and in history, which are Paul and Peter. And so believers first called Christians. There's controversy between Peter and Paul at Antioch. If you read Galatians chapter 2, 11 through 14, the controversy is Peter is there at the church. He's eating with some Gentiles, and they're having a good old time. And then some Jews come in. Paul calls them the circumcision party, comes in. And Peter immediately hightails it away and says, "Forget you Gentiles, I'm going to go eat with my own kind." And Paul sees this, and he's like, "What are you doing? This is totally unacceptable." And Paul and Peter get in a bit of an argument, and Paul rebukes Peter to his face. And so, this controversy between Jews and Gentiles and Christianity and all that, it's widespread. It's everywhere. And so Paul and Peter are both associated. It's easy somewhat to track Paul's missionary journeys because Acts follows that pretty closely. It's much more difficult to track where is Peter during all of this time. It seems that Peter probably spends a good deal of time at Antioch. And from some of the traditions and writings that happen, it seems that he spends a fair amount of time there at Antioch. Possibly he was an elder there. We know Peter is an elder. Possibly at Antioch, almost certainly at Rome, which we'll talk about in a bit. But Antioch is very important because it's the kind of sponsored church for Paul and for the work that he does throughout the world. Then you have the church in Rome, and the church at Rome is obviously going to be a very important church. It's important in the Bible, but it's going to be incredibly important moving forward. And we're going to talk a lot about Rome throughout the rest of this class. But when you think about Rome, the key figures you probably need to think about are Paul and Peter, both of them. And obviously we know Paul because Paul writes the letter to the Romans. And Paul goes to Rome. That's how the book of Acts concludes, right? But Peter is going to be very important there in Rome as well. So the Roman church is kind of an interesting case. It's probably similar somewhat to Antioch in that it's not a planted church by Paul or somebody like that. It's probably kind of an organic church in that in Acts chapter 2, when you have the description of all the peoples that are there and present for Peter's sermon at Pentecost, listed among those people are Roman Jews that are there observing the holiday. And so when the Jews who are there and have converted by Paul's or Peter's preaching, they're eventually going to have to go home. And so what seems to have happened is that there were Roman Christian Jews, Roman Jewish Christians, maybe that's a better way to put it, that go back home to Rome and they start up a church there in Rome. And so when Paul writes like the letter to Romans, he makes it clear he's never met these people. He's heard good things about them, but he's never met them. And a lot of the issues that Paul's going to write about in the letter of Romans are issues that talk about the struggle between Jews and Gentiles. Well, why might that be? We talked about this a little bit last summer, but what's the big event that happens that would cause a rift between Jews and Gentiles there in Rome? It's the reason Paul meets Priscilla and Aquila.
The expulsion of the Jews.
Yeah, you have the expulsion of the Jews. Emperor Claudius, around 49 AD, says, get these Jews out of the town. They're causing me problems. And what's interesting is that there's a writing that goes around, and it says the problem that he sees is a problem that's occurred by the Jews on account of Chrestus. again, there's some confusion about who the Jews are and who the Gentiles and Christians are. Claudius is probably seeing that the Christians are making some big rumbles in the city. And so, not understanding that Christians are different than Jews, he kicks them all out. Therefore, you have an expulsion of Jews from Rome. And so, you had a church that was predominantly Jewish there at the very beginning, expands and incorporates a lot of Gentiles because Rome is predominantly Gentile. Then all the Jews are kicked out, and now you're left with an orphaned Gentile church, and then the Jews come back in. And so you have a lot of problems. And so that's a breeding ground for problems. And a lot of what Paul does in Romans is he says, okay, listen, you Gentiles. Okay, now listen, you Jews. Let's set this straight. And so you have some challenges there. And so Paul eventually makes his way over to Rome, probably not how he wants to spend his time in Rome, but he's in custody. He appeals to Caesar. And so he goes to Rome, spends at least 2 years in custody, is what Acts tells us. And then eventually he will be beheaded by Emperor Nero in the 60s. Peter, like we said a little bit ago, is a little bit harder to kind of trace his trajectory throughout his ministry and his life. But he does at some point arrive at Rome, and probably arrives at Rome while Paul is still there. And so there's probably some overlap from what the sources say. And so Paul is there. It's very probable that he served as an elder at Rome. 1 Peter 5:1, Paul exhorts the elders, and he says, of whom I am one, I'm a fellow elder. This, I think, you hear a lot of people that talk about the papacy, the Pope, and they say, well, Peter was the first Pope, right? That's incredibly anachronistic. That's looking back on something a long time ago and applying modern definitions to what happened. That's very likely, well, it's wrong. And so, but there probably is a kernel of truth there in that Peter was probably an elder at Rome, a bishop at Rome, among others. And so to say that Peter was the first pope is wrong and anachronistic. But to say that Peter was an elder, well, that's probably true. You have a writer who's going to write, a guy by the name of Clement of Rome. He's very, very important. He is writing at the very tail end of the first century, early second century, and he writes a letter to the Corinthians, and he writes on behalf of the Roman eldership to the Corinthian eldership. And so he doesn't talk about, we'll talk a lot more about the development of the papacy and all of that. But he does not say, I am the one and only bishop of Rome. He's writing on behalf of the others. And so I think that's a significant thing. And by the way, if you read 1 Clement, it's really interesting. Basically, he says, you Corinthians, did you not learn anything from Paul? Like, what is wrong with you people? It's kind of fun to read. But at some point, Eusebius says that Peter had like a 25-year term as the bishop of Rome. Eusebius would be using that anachronistically as well. But it almost certainly was not that long. But Peter was probably an elder there for some time. Just don't know much details. And Peter, like Paul, was very, very likely martyred in Rome. And certain traditions say that he was crucified, and they were going to crucify him. And so seeing that he was going to be crucified, Peter said, well, well, don't crucify me in the same way as Jesus, because that would be dishonoring to him. So crucify me upside down, because I'm not worthy of being crucified upright. And so the tradition says that he was crucified upside down. Maybe not. But he was very, very likely crucified, or very likely martyred there in Rome. Any thoughts? Yeah.
Paul was a Roman citizen.
Yes.
But he wasn't born in.
Yeah. So Paul was born in Tarsus, right? Paul of Tarsus. There's several different ways you can become a Roman citizen. Probably what happened was someone in his family purchased it, and it was probably very expensive. And so Paul was probably from a wealthy family. But yeah, Paul was Roman, and that would be explained why he was beheaded rather than crucified, right? Not that it's a particularly pleasant way of dying, but that's a much better death than crucifixion, right? And so beheading would be a approved method of executing a Roman citizen. And so Roman citizens aren't getting crucified because they're Roman citizens, but they will be beheaded. So that's probably a result of his citizenship. Yeah. All right. Anything else?
Just one question.
Yeah.
How long was it, okay, the apostles and stuff from our Acts, and how long until Paul came on the scene as
Yeah.
an apostle, led to Damascus, converted?
Yeah.
How many years was?
I don't know the exact number, but not too long.
But then he didn't go to where the other apostles were.
Yeah. He does spend some time in exile.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it was kind of a space.
Yeah. I don't know the exact number, but it wasn't very long before Paul begins on the scene. But Paul's definitely active in the 40s. So, there probably is an answer. I just don't know it. So I'm not an expert. I told you people. So I'm going to use that one a lot in this class. So after Rome, we talk about Ephesus. Ephesus is an interesting church. Ephesians is one of my favorite books of the Bible. But when you think of Ephesus, you think about Paul, obviously. But you need to be thinking about John too. And John is a little bit less obvious in his role. So Ephesus is a church that begins with Paul. On Paul's second missionary journey, he goes, and he is the one who plants and establishes the church there. And Paul spends more time at Ephesus than any other church that he plants, it seems. We know he spends at least 2 years in the 50s AD. And when Paul leaves, he leaves behind Timothy to help work with the church there in his stead. And so you also, Timothy obviously is very closely associated with Paul. And so it's kind of interesting just how much of the Bible has something to do with Ephesus. Because think about the letters of Paul. Paul writes Ephesians, obviously, to the Ephesians. He writes 1st and 2nd Timothy to Timothy, but Timothy is at Ephesus. And so he deals a lot with the problems that are happening there at Ephesus. And you think about Revelation. Revelation, you have 7 letters to the churches in Asia. And so one of the first of those churches is Ephesus. You think about Paul also writes 1 Corinthians from Ephesus. You think about the writings of John, who's going to become associated with Ephesus. 1 John is a pretty general epistle. It's not necessarily to any one church, but he probably was writing that letter when he was in Ephesus. Same with 2nd and 3rd John. Potentially, the people in 2nd and 3rd John are potentially members at Ephesus. I don't know. And then John probably wrote the Gospel of John while at Ephesus, and John writes Ephesians or Revelation from Patmos. We know, but that's not too terribly separated from Ephesus. So Ephesus is a really big center and a big focal point for the early church. And so Paul is associated with Ephesus during the first half of the first century, and John will be associated really through the second half of the first century. John was likely an elder at Ephesus. And so in 2 John and 3 John, the first verse of both of those books, it's written by John, but his self-attribution that he gives is the elder to so-and-so. And so when John is writing these, he's probably talking about his position there as an elder at Ephesus. So Ephesus is really important. Tradition will say that Mary died in Ephesus because when Jesus is being crucified, Jesus gives charge of his mother to John. And so there's some tradition that says that John took Mary with him to Ephesus, and she ended up dying there in Ephesus. And perhaps the reason why John doesn't go to Ephesus until later in his life, a little bit later than some of the others, is perhaps he was remaining in Jerusalem, perhaps he was remaining in Jerusalem with Mary where James was, who was her son. And so, I don't know, maybe. But anyway, there's some traditions that say that Mary died there in Ephesus. There we go. And so finally, the last one we'll look at is the church in Syria. And we don't know a lot about this as much. It's obviously not a big focal point in like the book of Acts. But the Syrian church is very important. It's associated some with Thomas. And so you have in Syria, especially a little bit later on, you have a bunch of different pseudepigraphic or apocryphal works that claim to be the writings of Thomas, but aren't really. But there's a lot of them in the Syria area, which is kind of interesting. The reason why Syria, I think, is really important is it's one of the first places that the Bible's translated. And so perhaps even maybe the first language the Bible's translated into. We have a lot of Syriac manuscripts in the Syriac language of the Bible that are really important because they're very old. And they may be in a different language, but they still have a lot of importance. And so those are called versions, if you care about that sort of thing. But that's a big important thing about the Syriac church, Syria church. And so not too much else to say about that. Yeah.
So you've separated Antioch and Syria. Was Antioch not in Syria?
Not necessarily, I don't think. I need to look at a map. I separated that way because Ferguson separated that way. So, yeah. Ooh, why is it doing that? Okay. So, any thoughts about any of that before we get going? Yeah.
There are two Antiochs.
Yes, there are two Antiochs.
There's one in Syria. It's one where Paul began his missionary journey from. And there's one in Pisidia,
Yeah.
which he ends up going to on his first missionary journey.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So let's just some wrapping up thoughts. The apostolic age is very unique. It's unique because you have the apostles. The office of an apostle is not one that's going to stay around forever, right? There's a handful of them. There's the 12 You have Mattathias, obviously replaces Judas, and you have Paul. And that's it. And so when they die out, there's nobody to fill that office that they're holding because it's a unique office to them. It's not something that somebody else can fill. And they perform very interesting and unique functions in the church. They're able to give inspired writings and inspired teachings and things that are unique. And so there's a special guidance that they have. When you talk about this age, though, the Christians that are in the first century are very far from being perfect, even though they have the apostles guiding them. And I think that's very interesting. I think so often we would say something along the lines of, if Paul were here today, he would sort out all of the issues that we have. I don't want to ever receive a letter from Paul. They tend to hurt a little bit. But Corinth had a lot of letters from Paul, and they had a lot of issues. And so when we talk about restorationism, and I think restorationism is the way to go. We want to be the church that Christ intended us to be. And we want to base ourselves off the inspired teachings that the Bible gives. But we need to recognize that there's a distinction between the church of God's intent, church of Christ's intent, and the church that actually was. You have in the Bible, you have the standard for how the church should operate and the way they should be. But in practice, you have people that are very far from that standard. And that's no different than today. And so I think we need to, as we go throughout this class, keep that in mind, because what God said is what he said. And so his word is firm, it's unchanging, it is what it is. There's a lot to learn from the Corinthians and the mistakes that they made. There's a lot to learn from the church in the coming centuries that are good to learn from, but we may not want to replicate. So, just because a practice is early, just because there's something that the first century church did, doesn't mean they should have been doing it, and it doesn't mean that we should do it either. And so I think that's a really good distinction I want to make. Does that make sense? Is that clear? Okay. And so I think church history is really good to learn. It's very important. And the study of it will make us better Christians and know our heritage better and know God better. They make a lot of really good things about, a lot of good comes from the ages of church history, but there's a lot that's not good either. And so you just need to be careful as we go through it and be discerning and stick with what the Bible says, but learn from the history.